So thank you all for coming. Some people heard me say this morning when I started talking about this with our young leaders, they were like, well, I think we'd come to this. And I was like, well, maybe 2 or 3 people will come. So we're really glad to have such an auspicious group. And what we've talked about doing is really just sharing our story, each of us will, and then sort of among ourselves, but also with you, sort of start trying to talk about that. So with no further ado, we didn't really decide on an order of who was going to speak first, so who feels moved among the 5 of us?
I'd be happy to start.
All right.
Okay. My name is Mary Pellegrino. I serve on the leadership team of Baden. And just for a little background, I'm in the second term in leadership. And Patty, do we want to, is it important to know our ages? Does that help? Does that?
No, it's just interesting.
Okay, so by way of context, it's usually a point of interest that I have no idea where I was when Kennedy was shot. So I was probably about 11 weeks old. I was nursing probably, so I was born in 1963, have no idea where I was when Kennedy was shot, or any of those early foundational or formative experiences of older generations. And so I'm 51 years old, and I think when I considered this conversation and our conversations, what I can probably identify are the influences, what I find to be influences on my leadership style. Whether or not I consider them to be generational, I don't know that. So they might be generational, they might be situational, they might be personal, or they might even be universal. But by the fact that generations, so maybe some of them are generational, but what is most influential in my leadership style when I think back of my formative years is that the world and the church and the civil society that I grew up in was constantly changing. There was really no norm. I grew up, I went through 12 years of Catholic school, and I have 2 older brothers. They're 1 year and 3 years older than me. And I would always look at Nick's books in school to see what my books were going to be the next year. And so I'd always look at his religion book, and I'd say, oh, well, that's going to be my religion book. And then I would get to that grade, and it would not be my religion book, because they would be teaching something totally different. So what was a constant in my life certainly was change. Some of my early memories were the body counts of the Vietnam War on television. My early experiences of civil institutions were related to Watergate. In high school, the Iran-Contra affair. And my experience of church was that what I recall in my formative years is that I was raised in a post-Vatican II church, and yet what lived in my family was multiple generations. I was telling the others last night, my family was very, very active in our parish, and I grew up 2 doors away from my grandparents, my father's parents, and my father was a Eucharistic minister. Church was very big, probably 8 communion stations. And my grandmother would, if she was sitting in front of my father, would make her way as far as she could to the priest. And because that is what she did. So what I grew up learning was that multiple and diverse ecclesiologies can reside in the same family, and we can coexist, and we all survive, and we all love each other. And what I also remember from one of the influences I think on my leadership is that it was not unusual for me to go to my grandmother's house, and our pastor would be in her kitchen. And what I knew was happening was that my grandmother and two other women in that parish really knew the history of that parish, and they probably ran it to some extent. And my pastor, the pastor, I think, was humble enough to know that he could not lead simply because he had a position. I think he knew, and he was humble enough to understand that he needed to understand the people, and he needed to understand the parish, and he needed to understand the history. And only then could he lead. And I think that's what my grandmother and other women and other men of the parish were able to give him. So I think my leadership style has been influenced by understanding my need for perspective and my need to allow myself to be influenced. And also realizing that I serve in leadership for an organic community that has a long history, and that I can't lead simply because of an elected position. That I have to honor that history and know that history. And I don't, the history to some degree of the lived experience of the women in my community is not my lived history. And so I have a lot to learn from them. And I also entered my community, I think this is the other major influence, I entered my community at a time when we were changing our governance structures and our governance models. And so I entered when we were transitioning from a major superior and council to a leadership team. And to a leadership team that we have identified to function with equal and shared authority. And to the extent we're on that first team, we did not elect or designate any particular leader. We didn't have a president, we didn't have a moderator. It was very naive, and we simply said, go and do this. And about 2 or 3 years into the term, they came back and said, we can't function like this. So we have been successively tweaking that model, but that's when I entered, at a time when leadership was very collaborative. It was functioning very collaborative. We were working on a lot of our growing pains and our issues about authority as a community. And I think what I've learned from that is that that will continue to be transformed. And what has become more and more apparent is I think each team has grown successively more transparent, and given the complexities of our lives today and the decisions that we have to make, the influence of that successive transparency, I think, has come to be a hallmark of how I would consider good leadership and sound leadership, is to be the capacity to be transparent, and also the capacity to collaborate, which has, I think, probably, it's not, I wouldn't say that that is a hallmark of our generation. Others might say that. I think it's something that we simply learn as women around collaborating. I think also because I entered at a time when we were shifting our models of authority and governance and leadership, is I did not have negative experiences of authority to unlearn or to let go of or to reinterpret. I have never really had some of the more oppressive or very painful experiences of the exercise of authority in religious community that some of my sisters have had. And so that, I think, has been a tremendous influence, particularly on and sometimes that is not, I have to remind myself that that is not everybody's experience. And so when I'm surprised, when I'm perceived, when my leadership, the exercise of leadership is perceived by others to be something that it's not, I have to catch myself and say, you know what, you need to put yourself in their shoes. And so I would say for me, those are the influences, the constant changing environment in which I grew up, the experience of seeing positional leaders particularly in my parish, and how they functioned and how they appropriated their leadership, and the changing structures of authority in my own congregation.
Okay, I'll go to the next, Mary. Well, next to names, I think. I'm 56. I was elected when I was 53. And for me, when I thought about this, I was going round and round, and we've talked a couple of times on the phone. I kept thinking, what would be interesting or it might be helpful. And one of the things for me that was helpful, I would say my leadership style grew more out of since being in community. And other than, I think I was on so many sports teams through high school and college, that teaming part is like part of my DNA. So that part of it, I think, is transferable as a kid. And in formation, I used to joke with my formation director, because she'd always say, you represent the Sisters of St. Joseph of Orange. And I entered alone. And so it was a one-on-one, and it was different that way, because people talked about their bands, and they on and on and on about that. And I thought, okay, well, this is it. I'm it. So I tease about being 100% as a band. And how many of you can do that? So it's been, even though I entered alone, my formation really helped me understand, because it was at a time when you started talking about charism. It was in 87, 88, 89, was my novitiate years, and charism was being talked about. So I got to hear the charism, whereas a lot of the sisters I was around, even as soon as I got out of the novitiate, didn't have that same exposure. I remember going to Concordia for a Eucharistic letter retreat. Most of our sisters didn't get that kind of an opportunity. So what it did was help shape me early on, before I did any type of ministry, was to look through the lens of the charism. And I found that so helpful as a sister of St. Joseph, because as soon as I'm out there, I ministered alone for the most part all my life. And so I was it in terms of who they saw as a sister of St. Joseph of Orange. So as soon as they saw that cross, out of novitiate immediately. You were asked questions. I was asked to be the chair of the bioethics committee. I'm like, are you kidding me? I wasn't prepared for that, because at the time, ministry was so key that I had 1 year of novitiate and then you're out. That was not helpful, because like Mary, I grew up where God was love, that's it. I didn't have the Roman Catechism, I didn't have that grounding. So I always felt like I was faking it for years at first when I was a sister. I thought, geez, I don't know these things. And sisters around the table would talk, and they'd get into these songs and talking, and I'd be like, okay, I know what they're talking about. And so I kept saying that through my formation years. I really need the theology of the spirituality. I was getting the spirituality in different ways. I wasn't getting the theology. So when I was in formation, I was signed up to get an MBA. So it's like, okay, this is not what I was asking for. And that helped. I went into healthcare administration. And what it did do for me was, when I went into healthcare administration, again, it was with the lens of the charism. I was in operations for a while, I was in quality, then I was in, thankfully, got transitioned into sponsorship, mission integration, which is my passion. What it did for me was to be able to, it was easy for me through college, was able to integrate immediately charism with whatever I was learning. So that was important. I remember at Notre Dame going to your dissertation. It really helped me. Yeah, that really helped me to learn that in the novitiate. And so to be able to live my life by myself out there in ministry for the most part, but feeling secure in, I know what we're about. I might not have the theology, I finally got it. I'm trying to get a master's, but it was because I kept pushing for it. I think for people younger, they just don't have the background you all had. And it comes naturally to you. And I felt so insecure as a sister because I didn't have that, and it was the expectation from people. So part of my leadership really, the core of it has been spirituality, no matter what it was, whether I was working with physicians, staff, the nurses, or executive teams or boards. So that was key for me in the healthcare ministry. And I think what I want to say, and I've said this to our, unfortunately Eileen's not here on our council, when we first started talking about our spiritual ministries, it was always the spiritual care directors, the chaplains, and that was about it. I said, Eileen, I've been in healthcare 24 years, and I saw myself first as a spiritual leader. I was a spiritual leader. And so I think shifting that culture in your congregation, because they're a sister, that's where people see them first, no matter what their title is or what they do. So I think that's important for me, and it certainly has shaped myself as a leader. And I think as I transitioned from healthcare to the craziness of healthcare now, 3 years ago, to congregational leadership, that first year was rough because it was very new to me. I never paid attention to what the council did. I didn't know what LCWR did. I wasn't really involved in the federation, so it was like, oh my. And I was on a learning curve. I think what helped me though is to be at LCWR, to be at our federation, and to mix with sisters and listen. I tend to listen first and then get involved and talk. And I think the difference for me in healthcare and congregational leadership, obviously there's a lot of difference. One of the main differences is one, male, I'm not with men. And I was with men for my whole ministerial life, and I missed that. I missed their energy, I missed their teasing, I missed the way we were in ministry together. And I think the other thing that's different, and this came to me this morning, is I thought, I know there's something different I'm missing. I don't have peers in leadership, and all along in ministry I've always had peers my age, and that we've kind of grown up together in the different hospitals I was at. And that's what, it came to mind this morning. I thought, that's the difference for me. Although I have to say the team I'm with has been wonderful, because I really was so nervous that I'm the youngest on our team. I don't know if I will be accepted as a leader on our team, and that really scared me. And I think there's still some doubts that creep in, just because there's such a gap between some of us. Mary Beth's probably the closest, and after that there's a pretty big jump. And my experience is telling me something different, because it's been, they've been wonderful. And I couldn't have done a collaborative team the way we've done it without them. And we're trying to work on this membership, leadership, in making decisions as a whole, because we are small enough to do that. And so that's been part of it, and I've been on teams all my ministerial life, and we're trying to team with the community now. So that comes pretty naturally, and I enjoy that, and it's also, can be very frustrating, because it is process-oriented, and we need to keep doing the process, because that's what we committed to. So I've enjoyed being in leadership, although it's very different, and I know than I had expected, or that I thought, and yet there's been so many grace times, and I'm so appreciative of the other 4 women that I'm on the team with.
I'm Jean Marie Gaucher from Albany. We're in the 2nd year of our leadership term. I am along with, have a team of 6 women, 3 of whom have the Ministry of Province Leadership, and 3 of us who have other ministries. So I kind of say I'm not like on the front lines, because I don't deal with the day-to-day. Although I'm in the provincial house, so that provides a different tweak. I'm also the vocation director, so full-time, so that brings a lot of gifts to that. I'm 62 years old. I grew up, actually, as I was listening to Mary, I grew up I must be the transition woman, because I grew up at the end when Vatican II just came to be, so I competed with the boys to do the Latin in school, because I could do Latin better than them, but they got to be the altar boys, and we couldn't, you know. And then Vatican II came along, and things began to change. So I lived through that transition and spent most of my life in that. At the ripe old age of 18, I entered another community where the sisters that, of where I grew up, and it was a more traditional congregation. So, for 20 years, for kind of like 20 years, I was happy until, as I grew, like the congregation and I kind of went different ways. Because what I was experiencing didn't speak to me of what I thought religious life should be. So and going for spiritual direction, which was not the practice, and realizing that God wanted me to be happy, the way to happiness was to leave. So at the ripe old age of 38, I left and spent 10 years in ministry in between times, so it's another transition kind of thing. And have spent my life as far as ministry and education. So I became an elementary school principal before I left. And then again, when I went back to education, I met one sister at St. Joseph who happened to be, I took her position. She went on to the diocesan office. We became friends. And here I am. Because she recognized something and called that forth. And the moment I came into Albany, I felt at home. And since then, and you know, I think the first time I ever thought leadership could be different was we were at it was my first community day. I was an interested woman, didn't know anything from anyone. And a sister in the middle of the chapel, someone up front got sick. And there was the presenter up there, but the people, the authority figures in my mind, the provincial and all that, sat. The nurses came in, the sister up on the podium told everybody what was going on, but the nurses took care of the sister who was in need. She went out, and made sure she was well, you know, taken care of, and life went on. But it really impressed me that the people in charge, I mean, they were right there, so it's not like they weren't interested, but they let the people who needed to do what they needed to do, which was so foreign to me, because I came from a community where Mother Superior, you know, provincial and all that kind of stuff. So it spoke to me that there's another way of being able to do that, which touched my heart. And the other thing that's influential is I entered Carondelet at 48 years old in 1998. And in 2000, the Federation of Bishop began. So I am a product of the Federation of Bishop. Well, and first of all, it was the 350th. So I learned that this province was bigger than a province. It was a congregation. It was then this federation of 1,500 nuns, like, oh my God, around the world. In 2001, I went to the Federation of Bishops, and instead of being one person in Albany, I was a group of 10, which has shaped the rest of my life in community. And also how I see community, because I don't just see Albany, I see Carondelet, I see Federation. And now, with the help of the Federation, I see world. So it's like, it's a bigger piece. So being part of this team of 6, I also think that's part of the gift that I bring, is that I live in this bigger context. Or, yeah, I do live, because it's not scary for me to say we're going to, you know, oh, we're diminishing or all that, because it's like, I can go anywhere, you know. And here I am at home, and I know that there's new life, there's life in other places, and through the gift of the Federation and Gathering of the Daughters and all of that, there's a network of us out there. And that's the other transition for me, because I remember the old. I'm old enough to be the old, but I'm 16 years in community, so I'm new. I'm young, which was kind of nice. So I live in this dual world, but it's a gifted world because I get the best, all of the best, but I have this connection to the younger half, the newer sisters, etc., that is very life-giving and very encouraging and very fruitful. You want to go next?
Doesn't matter.
We'll just go in a row. So I really began thinking a lot about this when I started going to the leadership collaborative meetings, because there's 4 of us on the collaborative who are younger members who are trying to shape this initiative. And then I acted as the facilitator for a couple of sessions of the collaborative leadership development program. And as I interacted with these people, one of the things that I really recognized was I don't have a lot of opportunity to be talking with people that are my age and younger in religious life. And it was so funny because as I was with them, I began to see a lot of things about the group and the age cohort that I could really resonate with. And so now I want to kind of hop back to say when I joined the community, it was pretty clear to me that I joined because I was very interested in working with the poor. That had been my life through college. It was what I wanted to be about. And I recognized the need for a support group. And that's what I was really looking for in community. Now, that didn't end up being a lot of my early experience in community, but it was what I was looking for, and I always saw that there was enough of a core of people that would be possible. And then the big thing was I really felt like I belonged, or at least I belonged enough that it's where I wanted to be. But and I would say, I certainly entered with the idea that I was 24, I was 24, I had a master's degree in social work and I had worked, and so I was expected that I could speak freely and say what I wanted to say and it would be listened to. And so that's what I proceeded to do. And I was 24, so I of course didn't always say things in the most tactful, probably, way, or maybe effective way. But I began over time to recognize that my voice was very different from other voices. And I'll never forget being in a conversation with somebody about inclusive language and just really feeling like publicly I had had my head cut off because I was, of course, advocating for the use of inclusive language. And I just really thought, I don't think this is worth it to keep having these discussions. So I stopped the engagement. And I think one of the things that I recognized at this leadership collaborative thing is that I do believe that something that's typical of our generation is we go where the energy is, and we don't spend a lot of time on areas where we don't think things are going to move forward. And so as I've looked at things I've done, like one of the things I really have identified greatly with the Sisters of St. Joseph is living with zeal. And I can honestly say, I feel that this lifestyle works for me and I live it fully with zeal. And when I get into those kind of dead zone situations where I'm not feeling like, what I have to contribute, the rest of the group doesn't really want it, then I go someplace else with my energy. And when I was with these other young leaders, we were really talking about the mission and collaboration, and we weren't talking about it at high levels. Like probably none of us really want to be heads of hospitals or heads of hospital boards or, deans of colleges. We're kind of more about how can we spread the charism wherever we end up at that moment. So it was just really interesting to me to connect with these people and to realize I've never, or actually pretty much by the time I was 40, I wasn't very ambitious anymore. It's like I have responded to the opportunities that keep falling in my lap. Again, I always tell the story about this federation job, you know, when I was asked to consider applying, I was like, I saw the ad, but you know, I didn't have one. I don't have one of the qualifications that they're looking for. And so I was encouraged to go ahead and apply. I was like, well, what the heck, and I did. But it's like, I've never really sought out things. I've just responded when the energy felt right and it worked like a mix. And I believe that's kind of typical of our generation, that we're really attending to the energy and following that, and then being present with whatever is there where we are. Which doesn't mean we're not willing to work the hard work, but you know, the whole gospel thing, we kind of know, I think, when to shake the dust and move on. So that's kind of how I've been and how I've connected with these other younger leaders.
Okay, I entered at 25, and I am 61, and I entered with 3 other women, and within like 6 months, it was 2 of us, and it has been 2 of us ever since. And so I entered in the 80s, and what I found was that, like Mary, the congregation was going through changes in terms of how they were defining leadership. At that point, the buzzword we used was heart membership. You know, is there a heart membership here? And I love that word. And there were like maybe a critical mass of 30 younger members, like everyone that was under like 35. There were like 30 of us. And they really have stayed about 30. A couple have left, but most of us have stayed. And the ones just ahead of us were the ones that were going over the walls at the army base, and they were protesting. So this group was really the ones everybody was focused on, the radicals. And we that were a little younger didn't seem to be as radical as the next group, so they kind of liked us because we seemed to be a little more mellow. So I felt like in some ways we got some freedom that they didn't get because they were always out there pushing the envelope. And I basically tended to be a watcher, so I was observing all of this. And the other thing that from the day I entered, and maybe it was because, again, growing up in the 60s and the 70s, you always had the right to protest, to disagree, to say no. So, you know, the first time I was told I was going to go live here, I said, no, I thought I was going to go live here. And I remember the president of the congregation saying, well, I'm going to discern this, and I'll see you the next day. So the next day, she gave me a good reason why she wanted me here versus here, and I went. But it was always a sense of dialogue, and I think that's what I experienced, was a sense of dialogue and a deep listening to the call. So I can remember being at Catholic U at 30 and getting a call saying, would you ever think about hospital administration because we could use a new CEO? I said, oh, absolutely not. I have no interest in being a CEO. My passion is nursing. My passion is looking at nursing in new ways. Okay, they said, then, just get the CEO and keep going. I didn't envision myself as a congregational leader. I envisioned myself as someone who wanted to serve the dear neighbor in whatever way I kept being called to do that. And quite honestly, I had taken my name out of leadership, the leadership pool, when I had just turned 50, and I thought, I just have so much more to do in my professional life that I love that I'm going to take my name out. However, I constantly was preaching that we all should be discerning everything in our lives. And all of a sudden, there were like 6 sisters that had left their names in, and everybody was upset that there wasn't a bigger pool. And someone said, I want to hear about your discernment of why you all took your name out. I wanted to go underneath the table because I'm thinking, I didn't discern it. I just didn't want to do it. And it was because the sisters at that time didn't seem happy in leadership. They they felt drained, they looked like they were exhausted. They didn't seem happy people to me. So I can remember getting up and saying, you know, we could all look happier when we're doing it. You might consider it, you know, everybody's just kind of sad and tired. And they all looked at me like, are you nuts? And it was like, for me, I could then say that leadership is about midwifing. It's not about don't follow me because I haven't got, you'll get lost because I have no sense of direction. And Patty will say it's true that just the other day I had to get my GPS out to get back up here. So to me, it was like when I was elected for the first time at 50, I was the youngest member of the team. I've always been the youngest member of the team. However, there was desire to do it collaboratively. And there's been this desire to keep trying to hold whatever it is that's before us. And to me, the gift has been that every time one of us had an idea, everyone was willing to struggle with it. So we've worked with a Jungian therapist for the entire time I've been in leadership. We've been willing to bring in different individuals to help us process things. However, I can tell you how we learned this was, we weren't in leadership for a year, and we fired the Justice and Peace Committee of the congregation because we felt they were holding everybody hostage. And we didn't know how to do it, so we fired them. If you ever fire any group in the congregation, everybody then becomes passionate about that group, you know, and even though they've always been saying for years, we've got problems in justice and peace. We decided to fix it and resolve it by firing them. Everybody then became protective of that group. So we began to embrace our shadow. And we began to look at how do we hold the light in the dark at all times. And now, is that, what I can say is, to me, the young leader could be 80, but they're open to being with what is in fresh and new ways. So it's not age that we need in young leadership, it's the willingness to engage in what's there with fresh eyes. And that's been my experience, every woman that I have worked with, is that she was willing to engage reality with fresh eyes. And I have to say how I've learned that, we have learned that, is to keep growing in our contemplative skills and our discernment skills.
One of the things that I often find is that because we're such a small group, remember how we talked about the statistics earlier? There's 5, for every one of us, there's 5 of you all that are between like 65 and 75. And so when an older sister has a problem, there's like, oh yeah, we've known about her for years, you know, she's just that way. When one of us does something, I think it's seen as representing a whole group. And I've become much more sensitized about that since I started working with the Leadership Collaborative. And again, I can just say in this meeting, I've heard people say, well, you know, they're really not prepared for the things that need to happen in the future. Or I've heard people speak about what the young sisters don't have. And what I'm coming to appreciate is that and again, I don't mean this to be divisive, but I think we are really different. And I think we're different because we grew up in a different time with a different orientation. And I honestly think that we're a big part of figuring out where religious life is going to go. And it's going to be different, partly because it's different times, but it's also going to be really different because I think we are different. And I know we've had interesting dialogue.
We have had interesting dialogue because and I have to say, in our conversations among the five of us, I have been really particularly sensitive to not wanting to create a divisive, to position, the experience of younger leaders in a way that it's divisive, or the experience of younger members as divisive. Are we different? We're different as every generation is different from the generation before and after it. And so, yes, I do see typically each generation is reactive to the one before it. So there's probably some reactivity, to my immediate generation. And I think our generations sociologically are getting smaller. I think it used to be 20 years, 25 years. I think now you're talking 15 years could be a generation. And I think there are marked differences even within our generation, that it's very hard to generalize about our generation. But I do want to pick up, I think this is the connection, Patty, that you were saying, and also something that you said, Jane, that I think I also entered a time in my community. I entered in 1986. And in the generations prior there was a very strong commitment on the part of congregational leadership and formation to theologically prepare our sisters. It was not preparation for, there was a commitment to prepare for the ministry, but there was also a commitment to theological education. By the time I entered, that commitment had waned. And so I do think there are significant impacts and effects of the waning of theological preparation for our newer members, regardless what age they are. And we've had situations in my terms of leadership where we have women who are in healthcare, and as you know, the climate of healthcare right now, who entered, might be older than me or around my same age, but entered after me, were not theologically prepared to be perceived as a sister in healthcare. And finding themselves in really significant situations where they have to make some moral judgments and recognizing that they're not prepared. So I think there are, if there's anything that I would challenge our congregations to consider, is that for anybody entering right now, but typically it will be the younger people, preparation for ministry is not the same as theological preparation. And we're first sisters in ministry. And so I think theological preparation needs to take priority over, because we will not have the credibility that we need to have in those circles where we're ministering and being a presence of our congregations. So I think that's a real distinction that our generation lacks. It doesn't mean that we are not skilled professionals. It simply means that we're probably not prepared for a representative role in some capacity to be a sister in ministry.
It's interesting because I've had comments in our community, because we've moved now to almost anyone in formation will have a theology degree. And some sisters are saying, well, no, we need more of the business side, because they need to know how to run the congregation when we're no longer here. Well, for me, it's a both and.
Right.
You have to have it, because our churches and our structures aren't set up for that anymore. If you don't get it from the congregation, you're not going to get it. I think the other piece I would add is what was helpful for me in healthcare is, for our system specifically, mission integration has been very important, and we've done it for like 30 years. And I came into the position after Suzanne created it, what she enabled me to do is change things. And it was like, I thought, is this a sacred cow in our system? And it wasn't. And I think that was one of the things that I want to remember. If, things that I put in place in the system can change based on who's there now. It was that generous giving over and trusting, and I think that was really important. It was important for me to see that she trusted my leadership, and I want to be able to do that for others, no matter what age.
I think at this point, we'd really like to move to engaging like in dialogue and, you know, seeing what things you might have to say, and we can respond or you can talk with each other, and if not, we know from our phone conversations, if you don't have anything to say, we know that we can be talking. But we'd like to invite you into this conversation.
One of the things I came for was to really hear a little bit more about engaging younger members. Because in our early 60s, it's very different than the 30-somethings, and even the 40-somethings. So I guess for me, that's part of what I'd like to hear a little bit more.
What it sparks in my first being an extroverted thinker, it makes me think of even how much, well, two things. It makes me first think of Nancy Schreck's article about, from LCWR, and living in the middle, and in the middle space, in the middle time. And my experience of, through the gathering of the daughters of newer members, it's like they have constantly lived, their life has been lived in this middle space. So what better people to engage in that? Because they don't have, it's like, you know, when I was a principal, the younger kids don't have a fear of computers. They just go, and I'm like, should I hit this key or that key? Well, younger members are like, just try something. Just go, get it, let's try it and see if it works. They don't have a fear of failure, they don't have, it's in the, you know, the testing and let's see if it works. And if not, we'll try something new, which is not necessarily our, and I say our in the bigger context, way of doing things. You know, we need the committee, we need the proposal, we need it in writing, we need to have the plan and all that, because that's how we got where we are. But, and I'm not saying they're not financially responsible, but I think they come at it differently. And I think we need some of those graces and ways of looking at life, because that's what I think, how we're going to get through this. Not just, you know, and I can already see, now I've been in the community for 16 years, and I look at the women who are coming through, you know, in initial formation today, there's a huge difference, even in 16 years. So the difference, you know, from somebody who's been in 50 years is like, I mean, just think about how our technology, you know, renews itself. So how necessary they are to invite them and their voices to the table in some way, shape, or form, as well as to mentor them and to call them forth and saying, please don't wait until you know we're all leaving, because there's wisdom on this side. There's wisdom that they need to be able to learn from. So I don't know how you do that, but I see the necessity of it both, because without them and their sense of adventure, I'm not sure we're going to get through, but they need the wisdom of experience also. So
I think for us, I think we struggle a little bit with this in terms of it's not 100% what you want to do. It's what's the need and what's the congregational need. So there is that. I think we're struggling with how best to work through that. And I think secondly, it would be what helped. I think a turning point for us when we decided what we'd do with our Mother House in July was truly the 70s, 80s, and even some of the 90s really wanted to hear what the younger members wanted to do with Mother House. And each sister stood up and spoke. And I don't think I've ever seen that since I've been in. That's younger. And we're listened to. Because when we went in the chapel and said, who's going for this option, who's going for this option, most of the younger people were over here. And that was the decision we went with. So it was I think, a turning point for us, that we really did listen and say, okay, it's time.
Another thing I discovered is some of the younger members do like the more traditional approaches. So the younger members asked for an evening once a month for college students for adoration and night prayer. And they really developed a beautiful prayer ritual for it. Well, when it went out to the community to say we're going to do this once a month and invite our college students in, and anyone else who was interested, some of the older sisters went nuts. Well, you're leaving Vatican II behind, you're going back, you're going way back beyond. I mean, they didn't even let them, they didn't even go to experience it. They said, I will never step into that chapel because you just sold out Vatican II. I said, you know, we haven't sold out Vatican II. What we've done is I think we're moving beyond Vatican II into new ways of looking at old rituals that could be very life-giving. And so there are some that won't come. However, I cannot tell you the senior sisters that have come and see it now in a new way. And it's like, they even wrote out some of Ilia Delia's points about looking at the body of Christ as we gaze, you know, on Eucharist. It's very powerful, but it was like, there was almost this sense of division. And then could we honor what they're asking, and can we see how it goes? And if no one comes, or it's only 2 people in the chapel, the college kids do love it. But the younger members are trying to educate them into seeing what it can be that's deeper than maybe what it meant at one point. And so I think that's where, you know, we did take quite a beating over that, you know. However, it's really listening to what the younger members are saying.
And I think another piece that we talked about, I think on one of our calls, I know we've kind of talked about it a little bit on our leadership on this term, the previous term, and don't quite know what to do with it yet, but I think one of the overarching questions is, I mean, the reality, we've seen the demographics of our congregations. So, if we believe our congregations are organic entities, you know, that the dominant energy, developmental energy in our congregations is at the upper end. You know, that's the dominant developmental energy. I think one of the ways, the questions about engagement is how do we intentionally tend toward the developmental energy of our younger cohorts and allow age-appropriate and energy-appropriate expressions of the charism that are going to look different. And and in order to sustain their vitality for the charism, because, you know, I think which is not to say that the continuum of developmental energy across the continuum is deadening to anybody, but I think there are energy-appropriate expressions and age-appropriate expressions. And so how creative and flexible can we be in our thinking and in our living, and how generous of a spirit can we have to say that some of the diversity that we need to welcome in our community is around spirituality. It is around expression of the charism. It's not just welcoming diversity outside of ourselves, it's welcoming diversity inside of ourselves. And I think if there's a frontier of diversity, or, you know, that without distinction that we've not gone to yet, it's this, I think it's within ourselves. And this kind of, and I think we can be helped maybe by some of the research that Mary Johnson has recently done. To, you know, I think anecdotally, those of us who have served in vocation formation over the past, you know, 10 to 15 years, anecdotally have been saying that and seeing that. And now we see statistically that, so I think that's a good question for us is, you know, where, because we're very careful about creating age-appropriate and energy-appropriate ways for our older sisters to live. What kind of energy do we do for our youngest cohorts for the same kind of living? So it's not so much a solution as maybe a context to frame the work in.
May I ask you a question? What you said? We were talking about diversity. Are you talking about diversity of lifestyle? Are you talking about diversity of life forms? Can you?
I'm talking probably diversity of, I think, approach to a community, the diversity of spirituality, the diversity, and I mean, what I also mean to say too is I think that there is this constant discerning of what is a community's capacity. So can a community, does a community want to create a capacity for, living singly or living in twos or threes, or like in my community, we're struggling to live in groups. We do not have physical space to live in groups. Like I think we have 2 houses left that can house more than 3 people. So that I think we need to think about. And that has morphed over the years. There's some reasons for that in the diocese that we live in. But we actually have to be intentional about living in groups. So I think that's, if we're looking at if newer members are interested in living in groups, then that's a challenge for us. Now, we didn't intentionally say, hey, we're just not going to live in groups anymore. It has happened, and there's consequences to it. So that's kind of the. So it's just really, I think for us, it's being able to step back and consider the implications of some of the of just the things that have happened habitually or kind of unfolded, and to say, well, boy, are we really where we want to be or need to be, and how do we, make some different choices then?
I was in a conversation with Marguerite earlier today, and I'll let you describe the thing, but I'm not suggesting people wouldn't want to do exactly what you did, but the dynamic was that it was you and a group of younger people, so that kind of came together around a topic over time. So I think when you're wanting to engage younger voices, sometimes allowing them to be within a cohort, we're not necessarily in the same location, but we did well with video conferencing and phone conferencing. So finding ways to bring us together so that we hear each other's voice. Because again, I feel so lucky that I've been able to be involved with so many of our leadership development programs, because for me, to hear my peers in a volume, in a number that I have not ever experienced, has been really, it's mind-blowing. So why don't you just say a little bit about what you did, because I thought it was great.
I've been in leadership forever. And I know. One of the things that happened when I was asked to consider staying in leadership was people said, how are you going to transfer the information that you have and the experience you have to others? And I really pondered that for a while. What do you do? You just do it, We don't just do things. So I pondered and talked to some folks, and eventually I invited 4 of our younger women, truly the youngest of the younger. And
how old were they? Just how old were they?
Jen's in her 20s, Paula Treese is in her 30s. We're in 20s and 30s, and one's in her 40s. But it was just 4 people I happened to bump into. It wasn't even a serious, I want this person. It was just the first 4 of that group that I met. So there wasn't any significant selection. And I just said, would you be interested in, I don't know how this will evolve, but would you be interested in learning more about what I call the infrastructure of the congregation? Because they're out doing pastoral care and they're doing all kinds of other things. And they said, okay. And I said, what I'd like to try to do is let's just make this up together. And so I put together a list of topics that were things that I had worked on. I do a lot of the legal stuff for the community, I do the financial stuff, and so I put a lot of this stuff together. And then we had a phone call, a conference call, and I said, what I'd like to suggest is that 1 hour a month, we set up a time to talk. You pick the topic, I'll share about it from my point of view, but I want you to tell me what this feels like, what it looks like from your point of view. And so we've been at this for over a year. And anyhow, we talked about what are reserve powers? Never heard of reserve powers, never needed to know anything about reserve powers. But what is a corporation? How do you even set up a corporation? Oh, so those kind of things. It was really kind of just a fun conversation. And then I was telling the group, I said, last summer we came together for a weekend. They really wanted to be together because we had done this all by phone, an hour a month.
Wow.
And they came together, and one of them asked a question about, well, you know, this new CSJ initiative, and what this is going to mean, and how are we going to lease our properties, and what's it mean? And somebody else in the group answered. I was so excited. I didn't have to answer their question. The other thing that was really exciting to me, and the learning, it's certainly a mutual learning. I'm learning as much from them, maybe more, than hopefully I can share with them. For example, they raised the question, all of the schools are using Apple products. Our whole IT infrastructure is based on IBM systems. How are we going to deal with that? What's that mean for the younger members who want to continue using their Apple products? I don't have an answer, but it was a very, very good meshing of cultures that we get used to one thing and are even interested in hearing that there's another option out there. So it's raised my awareness in spades.